Thank you for being with us on the HIM channel. We are into a very hot topic right now. I promise you, if you missed part one, it's worth the trip to go back and play that and then pick up here at part two. I have a guest with me today that has been successful in finance. He ran a hedge fund of multiple millions of dollars. He has been an investor as well as an advisor to people that make decisions that run the world. He has international ties, he has domestic ties, probably the greatest wealth of information that we've ever had on this program. Join us now if you would, and let's pick up where the church is, where the economy is, where America is, and where you would recommend we go to support and maintain.
By every standard right now, most of the large banks in this country are insolvent. And let me give you a couple more reasons why. For example, everybody knows the last year and a half that interest rates have gone up.
Correct.
Well, long-term government bonds are one of the primary sources of collateral on a bank's books. So let's just say that a year ago, you had a 30-year bond, a long-term treasury bond, a United States long-term treasury bond. You had a 30-year bond and you had 25 years left till maturity. And that bond pays 2%. And what's happened the last year is interest rates have gone up. So that same bond in the marketplace pays 4%. So on that bond that you held for the next 25 years, you're going to make 2% less than what you could pay in the market to buy that same bond right now per year.
Right.
So that collateral on that bank's balance sheet, although it's the exact same bond, the value of that bond has gone down by at minimum 20 to 30%. So that's 20 to 30% of the collateral that the bank held on that bond all of a sudden that they don't have in place to meet their capital requirement.
Correct.
So that's one thing. The other thing is if anybody's noticed, there's certain areas in this country, urban areas such as San Francisco and New York and several other large cities, where the commercial real estate now, these buildings are empty.
Right.
So the banks have the notes on these commercial real estate loans, and all of a sudden the default numbers are going up and up and up and up. So the banks are getting hit on two different fronts. So even in a normal environment, without any additional leverage and any additional derivatives and those kind of things that do come into play, in any other just normal environment based upon what's happened with interest rates and happened with the commercial real estate industry, most banks are in serious trouble.
Can you explain for our public how that treasury bonds and notes are the hue and cry of financing the treasury to create all of the cash and leverage that we are giving away to other people?
So quite simply, we pay taxes to the IRS. The IRS is an entity that the monies don't go here into this country. They go offshore.
Right.
To different places. So your taxes that you go there. And then you have a Federal Reserve that basically loans you money. And so what do they do if we need more money? Historically.
They print it.
They just print it out of thin air with
Right.
nothing to back it. How else could you have $30 to $60 trillion worth of debt with a country with the resources that we have, paying the taxes that we have? And so, for example, the funds that we just sent overseas, we spent 130 some odd billion dollars overseas. Well, where did that money come from?
Well, the total that we've sent to Israel and Ukraine right now and to the other offshore entities such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, if you could believe that, this year is 1.2 trillion. And we had to print all of that, which means we are in debt for our third and fourth generation to pay it back to the Federal Reserve, who just created it. So
Yeah,
what you're saying is that the Treasury is creating bonds that they're selling to our allies, forcing them to buy because they use the dollar to trade with, and we're sanctioning countries that don't fall in line. And we're forcing our allies to buy bad paper. We're taking the paper and giving it to the Fed, who creates imaginary paper monopoly money as the Congress asked for it. So isn't that a Ponzi scheme?
It absolutely is. And so what happens if the petrodollar, which is backed by oil historically and the world currency, what happens if the majority of the world goes to a different standard? Let's just say a gold standard. They don't use our dollar anymore. What happens to the demand for those treasuries that we're cramming down these other countries' throats?
Well, aren't we going to have to buy those back in order to maintain our rating in the international community? And we can't do that because we have no assets to pledge?
Yeah, so the same entity that made the loans is going to have to buy back and create more money off of assets that don't exist. Eventually, you're going to have a problem. And so it's just, you're right, it's a huge Ponzi scheme, and a Ponzi scheme will work for a while. But at some point, it all falls apart, and that's where we're at right now. And so there's a lot of things happening right now to try to say, okay, so if this is going to happen, so we'll go to a different kind of currency, we'll go to a digital currency, for example.
Like the CBDC that's being rumored?
Right, and I have people ask, well, was that good or is that bad? Well, that depends. If the same people are responsible for the digital currency are the same private individuals that have historically owned the Federal Reserve, we got the same issue and the same challenge. Now we just don't have to print it, we just electronically print it.
We could do ones and zeros on computers and go from there.
Exactly, but now if the folks behind the digital currency are going to change things and actually have something backing the currency, such as gold, all of a sudden it looks a bit different. And so the rest of the world, interestingly enough, has already moved in that direction, but we've held out.
You're bringing up a question that I get asked almost daily. If the BRICS is going to the gold standard, now the BRICS, for you that don't know, is a group of nations, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa originally, but now they have over 29 more members, all of which are in the energy industry, OPEC, Iraq, Iran, Egypt. They're all joining forces with the BRICS, who is saying they are gold-backed currency, and they're wanting to take the place of the dollar in the international bank, and they're wanting to step up and take America's place. Now, that goes back to the question I'm being asked, is gold a good investment right now?
Well, gold is one of the few things that are actually real, that actually have value, always had value, and always will have value. Same thing with silver. So gold and silver are two of the things that you can actually hold in your hand that have always historically and always will have a certain guaranteed value. So if you think about it right now, 65 to 70% of the world, based upon what I've been hearing, is already on the gold standard.
You're correct. You're correct.
So we've been holding out. Well, you ask the question, well, why have we been holding out? Well, one, that would require that we basically put the gold back in place here to back it. That's an issue. The second issue is, if you truly have a currency system that's backed by gold, you can't just print $130 billion out of the air one day and send it across seas to basically go back into your own pockets ultimately.
Right. Well, have you been under the opinion that a lot of the money that we're sending to foreign countries is money laundering, actually?
Well, let's just take one example, and I'll pull this out because this is just on top of my mind. There could be hundreds. Just take Mr. Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine.
All right.
He is an extraordinarily wealthy man now. How do you know that? Because of the properties he's purchased in various places around the world, as well as here in the United States. Where did he get that money?
That's right.
He didn't get it from Ukraine. Where did he get that money from? And then all the other entities that are functioning in Ukraine that are non-governmental organizations and entities, where are they getting that money?
Well, let me ask you a question, because I know you're deep into the international monetary market and your contacts are pristine. The Rothschilds back in the Napoleon area backed both France and England in that war. Do you think that America's put itself in the same place where we're backing the Russians and the Ukrainians, just like we're backing the Taiwanese and the Chinese in the Middle East and in the East?
If you look at what's going on in Ukraine, you look at what's going on in Israel, you look at what's going on in Iran, there's one key element that always comes to the table to help.
Yeah, the American taxpayer. You know what I think the American people don't realize is you could get in a car in the south of France and drive all the way to Jerusalem or to the tip of Saudi Arabia if you chose. You would have to go through Russia, you would have to go through Turkey. If you went the other northern route, you'd go through China. All of these countries share borders with each other.
Yeah.
America is the only dog in this fight that has no border that we're sharing with an enemy, and now that's being complicated by what's happening in Mexico and the open border in Canada. We're being invaded by our enemies, and we're supporting other wars when at home we are not even lifting a finger to help the American people.
The financial situation, the economic situation, and the political situation in this country right now is dire. Our powers that be want nothing more than for you to think about a war in Israel or a war in Iran or a war in China or a war in Taiwan. All those things take you away from the things right now here that are the problem, the major serious problem here in our country, or the serious problems with our borders, with our finances, with our politics, and all of those things.
I'll reiterate this for those that haven't heard, but in 2004, after I spoke to the General Council of the UN, I was privileged to meet with Alan Greenspan. And at that time, he was the head of the Fed and ruled the geopolitical economy around the world. And he told me himself, he said, I think you have a good grasp on this, son. He said, I think that you understand what's going on. Do you have any questions? I said, yes. How long will it take the dollar to deteriorate? He said the U.S. dollar, the U.S. economy cannot survive past 2025 because it will be totally insolvent by then. Bernanke did his part. Now we've got Yellen and different ones doing their part. They are destroying the American dollar and the American economy. And I think politicians are saying, look to the right, look to the left, look at Taiwan, look at Ukraine. And they're taking our eyes off what's really happening in America. But we are losing our grasp on our economic freedom here. You know, the dollar that was given to the Federal Reserve in 1913, December the 23rd, actually, 1913, was worth 100 pennies. That same dollar today is worth 3 cents and dropping with inflation. If we lapse into hyperinflation, will that demand that they do a gold standard or silver standard, and by doing so, do an international reset, which everybody's talking about, but I don't think they're going to reset the dollar. I think they're going to reset the price of gold and silver. How do you feel on that?
Well, there has to be, something has to give. It cannot continue like it is because, you know, with them creating the amount of funds out of thin air that they're already creating, our actual inflation is close to 20% right now. And the interesting thing is the way that they report inflation, they take out oil and gas and food. Which are the only, by the way, two things that people have to buy.
Would you explain what the CPI is and how they determine the rate of inflation with the CPI?
They take the price of goods that are going up without the price of goods that you actually have to buy. So if for example, the only thing a person has to buy is food, and most people have to have fuel. Right. But if you take those two elements out, food and transportation costs with oil and gas, inflation may not be that big a deal. Because here's the thing, if everything else is going up dramatically and the demand goes down, the supply goes up, and you have all kinds of interesting issues, and all of a sudden right now you're in a situation where you've got, gas prices are much higher than they were 3 or 4 years ago.
Right.
Food prices are dramatically higher than they were last year.
Right, last month even.
And so what's going to begin to happen, if you take those two things out, inflation doesn't look that bad. You don't take out everything that basically is important for people that they have to use on a daily basis. That's just ridiculous. But it's all political.
Are
If
you
they came
saying the
out,
politicians are changing the rules in the middle of the game?
well, they've been changed for a long time. But right now, it's even more significant because if you actually came out and said inflation is 20%, which people already know, people would be even more upset than they already are. The amount of debt on credit cards is going up dramatically.
Oh, it's
The
phenomenal,
amount of
right?
defaults on credit cards are going up dramatically. And by the way, that goes back to whom ultimately? The banks.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm finding out that J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citibank, Wells Fargo are calling that unrecoverable debt. And 90% of that unrecoverable debt is either commercial real estate or credit card, and credit card is overtaking commercial real estate now.
I mean, I'm not surprised right now. I mean, I read something the other day about the extraordinary increase in the amount of reserves the banks are putting on the books in order for them to cover the credit card defaults that they have coming.
Right.
And those numbers have doubled here very, very recently.
We are looking at I'm going to say a crash. They're calling it a recession with a soft landing, but I'm calling it a depression because we are well below the depression rates of the early 20s. So what happens to America right now if this insolvent debt, that unrecoverable debt, is actually listed in their off-ledger assets, and then they can't comply with the Basel III ruling, which means they have to have more Tier 1 assets than they do loans to a percentage. What happens there? Can they exercise that and call these banks insolvent? Or will the FDIC or the feds just print more money to try to give them off-ledger assets?
Well, I think they'll try to just print more money as long as they can.
Well,
But
wasn't
I
that
think
what
that's
that bank temporary monetary funding was for? They did.
well, it was, but they have other ways to create monies very, very short term. So ultimately, the gig's up. You know, what if most of the rest of the world is in a similar position as the United States is? And that's the question that's difficult. What I don't think you can look at just the United States in this without looking at the rest of the world and how the rest of the world is also affected. For example, because of the historical reliance on the dollar, if the dollar were just allowed to go down and tank, what would it do to the rest of the world? There has to be a solution where there's in effect, worldwide reset.
Right.
And when I talk, but that reset has to be significant, and I think you're already seeing that in some respects with many of the countries going to the gold standard.
Right.
But until the United States and some of the other very, very large countries do the same thing, you're still going to have these issues. But the interesting thing is, if we have an issue with our banks here, our banks are global. And they have a global impact because they're also in other countries. Is you can't just say, okay, well, what does the United States do? You have to look at how do we, in a global fashion, clean up the mess that, quite frankly, we've all been complicit in, knowingly or unknowingly.
Well, let me ask you this. The only way to do a reset that would actually work is not to reset the dollar, but to reset the value that is or the asset behind the strength of a currency. So if the entire world went on a gold standard and they reset the value of gold, according to Jim Ricketts or Andy McGuire or some of the experts in precious metals and applications, they're saying that gold could go up to $10,000, $20,000 an ounce in true value, and that silver could go up to $3,000 an ounce. Is that true?
Oh, it's absolutely true, and that probably ends up happening. But that takes a coordinated effort. Which, by the way, what's interesting is you've got probably a majority of the world right now that's on that path already.
Right.
And quite frankly, I think we have no choice but to be on that path. But the challenge is this: I don't see any alternative where there's not a period of time. And I don't know how long that lasts. There's going to be a period of time, though, where there's going to have to be a significant adjustment period. And I think that's going to be not only painful, I think it's also going to be needed. Because if there was an easy way out of this, we would go and do the same thing again. That's just what human beings do. But if we feel a little bit of the pain and say, you know what, I know how we got here, there will at least be a period of time where we won't forget. And I think that's important. But I think there are things in place right now to begin to move in that direction. It's going to be painful, though, because you don't get in the situation that we're in and get out of it easily without some sort of a correction.
If our treasury notes and bonds are losing value and they're brought back, even those that they hold to maturity, we can't pay them in anything of value to redeem those notes. So doesn't that make those notes insolvent?
It does. The major holders of all those debts are governments and central banks.
Sovereign country, right?
The good news is the private entities that got you into this are going to take the hit coming out of it to some degree as well.
So private equity is going to take the fall in all of it.
Well, it is private equity, but primarily, the individuals that own the central bank are going to take some sort of a hit coming out of it. They have to.
Well, in the de-dollarization of the economic community here and abroad, they are no longer honoring the petrodollar. That's people don't understand that America has used the dollar as a weapon in many countries, and we're not loved by those countries like the general populace here are told. And America is not the fair-haired child in a lot of these countries because of the way the politicians have used the dollar as a hammer, as an axe, as a gun, as a weapon to destroy other countries that do not fall in line with our American policy. You know, when Russia was sanctioned, do you realize that the American government stole hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets from Russia by confiscating all the dollars that they had in the various central banks around the world and wouldn't let them use them? But on the other hand, though, and I don't want to get geopolitical here, but when Biden stopped the pursuit of petroleum in America and cut off our energy sources that we were deporting, the price of oil, gas, and natural gas went up, which gave Russia the ability to sell their oil and gas. And in essence, we're financing the war in Ukraine by cutting back on manufacturing of energy here in America. And, this whole thing is a vicious circle, and somebody's got to have enough sense to stop the carousel. And that's what I call the reset. Do you see it that way?
This is at the end of the day, this is a vicious cycle of control and greed. And what has to happen is there has to be a reset where things cannot be controlled. For example, in this country, with many things you see as far as medicine and different things, they're trying to control the population.
Right.
They can do that. They can do that through the pocket strings. They can do it through medical. They can do it through all these different things. There has to be a change and a reset where the people begin to have their own freedom in a sense again. And I think you're seeing that happening. I mean, if you take just the United States, I think you can notice over the past year, there's been a lot of folks that have kind of opened their eyes. Anybody that would have said a couple of years ago, certain things they're looked at as a conspiracy theorist or this and that. Well, now people are going, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense anymore.
Right.
But we've all been, unfortunately, somewhat complicit in allowing somebody else to make decisions for us and sticking our head in the sand. And that has to end, or the same people that have control will end up having it again. Well, and that's just human nature, unfortunately.
Well, let me ask you this. Beware, be ready. But don't you think that when you stop and look at America and where we are right now financially, politically, and with civil disorder, Social Security is benefiting right now from pandemic, from abortion, and from wars around the country because it's depleting the number of people that will be eligible for Social Security in the next 25 years. And when you look at abortion, we've wiped out 2 generations that eliminates some of the need for Social Security. And I'm saying that because if we stopped right now and said we cannot afford Social Security, it's insolvent and bankrupt, we're going to cut the checks off, we would have more civil disorder than we have ever had in the history of our nation, because we have more dependence now on government entities than we've ever had in the history of our nation. So if you cut off the food supply, you cut off the money, you cut off the medical care because it's insolvent, suddenly you have to go back and say, how did this happen? And that's because by giving away money to other countries and trying to overthrow regimes and do what I call controlling the government or the entity of the common man in other countries, we have bankrupted our country. So when we stop and look at the agencies that are dependent on taxpayers with what I call deficit spending or funny money, the only way to do this is for somebody to hit the brakes and say, we can't afford it anymore, and it's going to hurt a lot of people. But don't you think the people that are really going to come out ahead are the families who own the debt of these countries and can use it to manipulate the government entities in various foreign countries for their benefit?
Well, that's certainly the case and has been the case, and unless something changes, that will continue to be the case. But I do feel like that there are things that are happening for the normal person to stand up and say, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore.
Well, you know, you made a beautiful statement. We're not doing this broadcast to create fear. We're doing it to create knowledge so that there won't be fear, because we know how the story ends. This broadcast, the HIM channel, is dedicated to bringing you knowledge that you're not hearing Sunday morning, Sunday night in the local assembly. We're not trying to create a spirit of fear. We're not trying to cause you to do things that are against the body of Christ, just the opposite. We're asking you to join us in prayer. We see what's happening. We're sounding the alarm. I know the remedy, but I don't know how we get to the remedy without God's intervention. We need a miracle in America. We need you to hold us up in prayer. If you look over my shoulder, you will see a QR code that will take you to our website. We need your questions. We need your input. We need your help financially. Hit the donate button and help us bring this truth to you. We need your help in these last days. May God bless you, bless your children, bless your home, and may God bless America. Thank you.